Hey there, and welcome back to the Sim Racing channel where we're not allowed to go back to Germany, so we keep finding excuses to go back to the virtual Nürburgring. Those who followed this channel since the early days will know that the Nordschleife is my favourite racetrack in the world, which I had a borderline obsession with when first getting into sim racing. It constituted hundreds of hours of my racing in project cars too, and since has constituted hundreds more in Assetto Corsa and rFactor too. I recently bought the Nürburgring track for Automobilista 2, and after driving it a few too many times, somewhere in among all my cursing the gods that I couldn't find the last 7 seconds on the leaderboard to get first place, I had a bright idea. At the time of writing, Automobilista 2's version of the Nürburgring is the most current in sim racing, being based on the resurfaced 2020 version of the track. Because my laps in AMS2 were a full 10 seconds quicker than comparable laps in Assetto Corsa and rFactor 2, I thought, why not compare them head to head with real life and see which version of the Nürburgring is the most accurate. For fairly self-evident reasons, we'll be omitting the race room and iRacing versions of the track, as Assetto Corsa's classic laser scan and rFactor 2's recent implementation of the 2018 version of the track are generally considered the frontrunners. It goes without saying that if you want the most recent rendering of the track, you'll be defaulting to Automobilista 2. That aside, because it was only 2 sections which were resurfaced in 2019, the AMS2 version should still largely be identical to the other two. A small caveat of this test is that I struggled to get the correct angle on the AMS2 version, as it didn't appear to have a dash-mounted camera perspective to emulate the real-world lap camera, like the other 2 titles did. So with that said, make sure to smash that subscribe button and let's put our race detective hat on. Coming up to T1 in all the sims, we see that their renderings of the new Sabine-Schmitz curve is quite lifelike. From a pure graphical perspective, the AMS2 version is arguably the most impressive and seemingly has the closest texturing to the actual road surface. For some reason, however, the curbing both looks and feels much flatter in AMS2 than the other 2 versions. It could be an FOV or perspective thing, but the curbs in this title also feel more forgiving. Coming up to the wall here at Hutzenbach, we see the first major difference between the 3 versions. Like the new real-life version of the Nürburgring, AMS2 has the wall brought closer into the track. This was, after all, part of the renovations which took place in 2019. Notwithstanding, its curbs tone texturing on the right doesn't seem quite correct when we compare it to real life, with the real-life strip being more narrow. You may also notice the car bounces substantially less in real life, but that's less to do with track geometry and more with AMS2's current physics model. The S's are largely identical, though the AMS2 exit curb is way too wide. Moving on down to Flugplatz, you'll notice that despite AC's version aging very well, it does provide a more coarse rendering of the track bumps with the jagged behaviour of the car, especially compared to the super high detail mesh of the rFactor 2 version. Once again, the exit curbing on the left at Arenberg doesn't seem steep enough on the AMS2 version. Meanwhile, the geometry of the curbing in rFactor 2, while seemingly very accurate, has some strange discoloration in it. For some reason across all of the PBR updated tracks in rFactor 2's catalogue, the road texturing has become lighter. As a result, visually, the road surface in rFactor 2 looks the most off-color, even though in terms of feel, it seems to have the highest detail mesh. Going up through the foxhole, all three versions are very similar with the curb to the inside, while AC lacks the correct fencing to the right. Going into Adenauer Forst, we can see once again that AMS2's curbing is too wide compared to real life. While AC and rFactor 2's versions both look more geometrically correct, rFactor has the most correct texturing and overall look. Coming into Metzgersfeld, rFactor's version is the only one rendering the spectator area to the right, and AMS2 once again has too wide curbing on the inside. Throughout the section, we can once again see that rFactor 2 has the most true-to-life curbing, including the most true-to-life texturing, even if sometimes there's strange discoloration over it. This section through Miss Hit Miss is one of the resurfaced areas from 2019, so AMS2 should have a flatter surface through here without the dip on the inside. However, this doesn't appear to be the case, at least not from my observations. Though it's difficult to be absolute here, each sim has a different interpretation of physics, and it's difficult to judge between videos. Moving on, we can take a moment to appreciate that AMS2 arguably has the highest fidelity graphics in this comparison, though going through X Mueller it once again seems to have the most off curbs. That aside, the similarities between these tracks are greater than their respective differences, and it's super impressive how accurate they are overall. How will each sim render the iconic carousel? Well, let's find out. Interestingly, the most lifelike rendering of the carousel appears to come in AC. The strange discoloration of textures in rFactor 2 is doing it no favors, and the geometry of the carousel just feels too forgiving in AMS2. The carousel in AC is bumpy and nasty, just like in the real world. Whipperman feels astoundingly accurate in all three sims, which is great news with it being my favourite corner complex to drive on the Nordschleife. Coming out of Brünchen, we can see that the inside curb is once again less cambered and more forgiving in AMS2 than the other two titles. Heading onward through Sector 3, the tracks are all remarkably similar, with the standard differences generally applying between them. rFactor 2 with odd discoloration on the track and curbing here and there, with AMS2 occasionally coming in with incorrect curb geometry. This is once again obvious at the mini carousel, where the original AC version has the most correct color balance. All three versions are very good down Döttinger Höhe, with the main split between them being the graphical presentation. In my opinion, AMS2 looks the most lifelike here. With a few superficial differences, they're all more or less on par towards the end. So, have you noticed a few running themes appearing? That was a long run through the Nordschleife, but let's quickly recap some of the defining characteristics of the tracks. AC has the oldest version of the track, marked by all the graffiti and slightly more ragged appearance. That aside, it's held up remarkably well and can still easily train someone to quickly drive about 90% of the modern day Nordschleife. This version is marked by a fairly realistic rendering of the tarmac, decent bump detail with a touch of coarseness, and extremely coarse carousels, coincidentally aligning best with the real-life versions. The curbing is a little bit jagged, and prone to launching cars around even more so than the real track. This is of course exacerbated by AC's aging physics model and simplified tyre and damper behaviours. rFactor 2 has the second most recent version of the track, having come out in 2019, though still being based on an older 2018 laser scan, prior to the recent resurfacing. Compared to the original AC version, the rFactor 2 version's road surface feels more nuanced and granular. The car somehow hugs the bumps better because there's more detail in their gradation, and you're less likely to get bounced around due to too few polygons. That aside, rFactor, ever since the PBR update, has had an off-coloured road surface, and in the case of this track, some discoloration on the curbing too. I'm unsure why they updated the track to be less like real life than it originally was, but in my opinion, the PBR update was a side grade rather than an upgrade. It has the most fictional colour balance and road surface texturing. AMS2 represents the latest version of Nordschleife that we have in sim racing. As such, it contains some of the recent changes, such as the brought-in wall at Hutzenbach. That said, it doesn't feel a whole lot different to drive than the other two beyond that. The AMS2 version, in my opinion, looks the best overall. It has the best texturing, the most engrossing overall appearance, and with the AC version represents the closest look to the real world. However, it's marked by less than accurate curbing around the track, leading to an experience that's too forgiving. It could do with a curb refinement pass based on photogrammetry data from the actual circuit. One thing that I don't want to delve into too deeply here, but is still relevant, is how the physics engines of each title play into this. You would have noticed that the cars moved over the track quite differently between titles, and that ties into their respective ways of rendering car behaviour. AC was by far the hardest to drive. The 911 had a tendency to lose the rear at the slightest disturbance and needed heavy tuning in order to gain stability. This, unfortunately, gave it a ton of understeer character, which slowed down the lap time substantially. It would have required more tuning to balance the car out properly. The AC physics engine led to the car being very easily disturbed over curbs. As such, I couldn't afford to be as aggressive as I normally would, nor as aggressive as a real-life GT3 driver might be. rFactor 2 was far easier to drive. The 911 is quite responsive, and with its signaling of weight transfer and mid-corner behavior, I was able to attack the curbs as intended and more or less drive with the lines I wanted to be driving. The more nuanced track mesh also allowed a greater interplay with the road surface and overall contributed to a feeling of greater engagement while driving. AMS2 is the most recent and most heavily in development of the three titles. As such, the car behavior over assorted sections of the track is very strange. In fact, my lap time in it was nearly 20 seconds quicker than an AC for the same car. It is extremely forgiving to aggressive driving, and combined with the lower cambered, more forgiving curbing, allows one to push harder than might be conceivable in the real world. The net effect is that my lap times between the three runs in different sims varied wildly, even though they were all done within the same span of time. AC was the most difficult to drive, rFactor 2 was far more forgiving, and AMS2 was the most forgiving. Ultimately, all three versions of the track were hugely impressive. We're really spoiled for choice in sim racing, and knowing that we have such high fidelity recreations to practice our knowledge of such an iconic 20-kilometer stretch of road is just amazing, irrespective of whichever version manages to nudge out the others. You would have noticed some absences from this list, namely the race room and iRacing versions of the Nordschleife. While both are laser scanned and perfectly serviceable in their own right, in context with their respective sims in the scope of this test, they largely would have just wasted time, as neither of them would have been a viable contender for the win, and this video was always going to get quite long, even with just the top 3 contenders. So, with all that out of the way, which one do I think is the quote-unquote best version of the Nordschleife in sim racing? Well, this is of course subjective and backed up solely with hundreds of hours of driving tests and being on the actual circuit in real life, but from my experience, the clear winner is the rFactor 2 version. This is perhaps no surprise to anybody familiar with the rFactor 2 track team, as they're presently leading the industry in many ways when it comes to packing sheer fidelity into track recreations. Ever since the release of Sebring, they have been putting out cutting-edge, laser-scanned recreations of assorted race circuits. Is it perfect? Not at all. The road texturing and discoloration issues perplex me to no end, especially given that they weren't so much of a problem before the update of the track. The carousels also feel a bit strange and overly smooth, with a tendency to shoot the car out of themselves. That aside, the rFactor 2 version feels like it has the most nuance and detail in the road mesh. It feels like there is centimeter level resolution as the tyres convey all the information of the road surface to you. It's quite sublime and immersive on a level that's just unmatched. What do you think? Do you agree with my assessment? Let me know in the comments down below, hit the subscribe button to get notified of future sim racing geekage, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.